All right, so we're diving into some really interesting stuff today. Gynocriticism. And honestly, when I first saw the term, I was like, okay, this is going to be a tough one.
Yeah, it sounds a little intimidating, doesn't it?
Yeah,
But it's really fascinating stuff when you get into it.
exactly. And the material you sent over, it really frames this whole idea of how we understand women writers in a completely new way, not just as, women who happen to write, but as a distinct tradition.
It's a huge shift in perspective. We're not just looking at how women are portrayed in books written by men anymore. Now it's about centering women's own voices and experiences.
Right. So we're talking about gynocriticism. Our source mentions Elaine Showalter, who coined the term in her essay, poured a feminist poetics. What was she getting at?
Showalter's main point was that we need a new framework to analyze women's literature. Like, we can't just keep using the same tools and models that were built around male experiences.
That makes sense.
We need a female framework, she called it, something that really digs into the core of the female experience.
A framework built on women's experiences. So it's not just about saying, oh, a woman wrote this. It's about analyzing specific elements in the writing through that lens.
Exactly.
What would those elements be? What's gynocriticism actually focused on?
Well, first off, there's female authorship. Who are these women? What were their lives like? What were the social and cultural contexts they were writing in? Then you look at how women are portrayed in their own writing. But even more importantly, you examine the feminine experience itself as it's depicted in those texts.
Okay.
What are the ideas, the beliefs that shape how those experiences are understood and portrayed? And then, of course, there's this crucial element of understanding the history of female literary tradition.
Like its own unique evolution.
Exactly. It's not an offshoot of male tradition. It's its own thing with its own development, its own concerns.
You can't understand any group of writers without considering their history.
Right, right. Now, gynocriticism obviously didn't just appear out of thin air. Were there any earlier figures who were already starting to explore these kinds of ideas? Oh, absolutely. You can trace it back to people like Virginia Woolf in the early 1900s, and then Simone de Beauvoir a bit later.
Right. Big names.
They were already questioning how women were portrayed in literature written by men and pointing out the sexism and limitations in those portrayals.
Yeah, like Woolf in A Room of One's Own, right?
She had that thought experiment about Shakespeare's equally talented sister.
Exactly. What if Shakespeare had a sister who was just as brilliant but was never given the opportunity to write because she was a woman? And then de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, that was a landmark text.
Huge. And the 1960s, that must have been a turning point. You know, the whole feminist movement, that had to have some impact on how we look at women and literature.
Oh, the 1960s were massive. That whole wave of feminism really pushed these questions about male dominance to the forefront. And that absolutely included the literary world. It was all about challenging the status quo, saying, hey, women's experiences aren't being accurately represented or understood when you're only looking through a male lens. Right. And so then we get to gynocriticism really solidifying as an approach in the late 70s, early 80s. And it seems like it was heavily influenced by some pretty complex theoretical ideas. We were talking about post-structuralism and psychoanalysis.
Yeah, those are big influences for sure.
Okay, I'm going to need some help with this. What did post-structuralism bring to the table when we're talking about understanding women's writing?
Well, you see, post-structuralism is all about questioning everything, questioning fixed meanings, established truths.
Like challenging the idea that there's only one right answer.
Exactly. It's saying that language itself is slippery, it's ambiguous. The meaning of anything, even a literary text, is never truly fixed.
It's open to interpretation.
Right. And that really resonated with gynocritics. They were like, okay, so if language isn't stable, if meaning isn't absolute, then why should we accept interpretations of literature that have always been dominated by men?
So it opened up the possibility for different interpretations.
Yes. Diverse female readings, new perspectives that had been silenced or ignored.
So post-structuralism was all about challenging the way we think about meaning. And then there's psychoanalysis, specifically Freud's ideas. How did that influence gynocriticism?
Well, psychoanalysis, it's all about the inner workings of the mind, the subconscious, concepts like repression, the struggle to form an identity.
Heavy stuff.
It is. But it gave gynocritics a way to delve into the inner lives of women as depicted in literature. What were the psychological challenges they faced in developing a sense of self in a world that often felt restrictive or oppressive?
Right. And one of our sources, Karen Horney, she argued that this whole idealized image of woman, it wasn't something natural. It was constructed by men.
That was a key insight. It really highlighted the need for gynocriticism to look beyond these imposed ideals and uncover a genuine female literary tradition.
It makes you wonder, like, how much of what we think we know about women in literature is actually true, and how much of it is just a reflection of male perspectives. Now, Showalter herself proposed a really interesting model for understanding the development of female literary tradition. She talked about three distinct phases.
Oh, yes. Showalter's three phases. First, you have the feminine phase. This was basically everything up until the 20th century. Literature in this phase often presented idealized images of women, the whole angel in the house kind of thing.
Hmm.
But those ideals were largely constructed within a patriarchal system, defining women in relation to men.
So women were defined by what men thought they should be, not by their own experiences and perspectives.
Exactly. Then came the 20th century, and with it, the feminist phase. Now, women writers are directly challenging male authority, questioning those restrictive norms. It's a much more confrontational activist phase. And finally, you have the female phase, which Showalter saw as the most contemporary development.
And what defines that phase?
The female phase is about moving beyond simply reacting to male definitions. It's a search for a truly independent female identity and artistic expression. Women are defining themselves on their own terms, creating a space that's authentically theirs.
That's pretty powerful, that idea of moving from reaction to creation.
It is, and it's about recognizing the existence of a distinct female canon, a body of work by women, and acknowledging the importance of the female reader in understanding that literature.
Right, the female reader who brings her own experiences and perspectives to the text. So we have this journey, right? Internalizing the norms, then resisting those norms, and finally creating something new and authentically female. But like any approach to literature, gynocriticism has faced its share of criticism. What are some of the main arguments against it?
One of the biggest criticisms is that gynocriticism can be a bit essentialist, meaning that it sometimes assumes a kind of universal womanhood that doesn't really exist.
Like assuming that all women share the same experiences.
Exactly. Critics argue that it oversimplifies things and doesn't adequately account for the huge diversity among women based on race, class, sexual orientation, you name it.
Right, like our source has this great quote from Friedman who says, "The self is not singular, it is multiple. We're made up of so much more than just our gender."
Exactly. Our identities are complex, and focusing solely on gender can be pretty limiting. Another criticism is that some early gynocritical work was too reliant on Freudian ideas and new criticism, which some felt didn't allow for a broad enough understanding of social and political contexts.
Like it was stuck in a particular theoretical bubble.
Yeah, kind of. And there was a lot of criticism, rightfully so, about the exclusion of lesbian and women of color voices in some of that early work.
That's a huge issue. Like you can't talk about women's experience and ignore entire groups of women.
Exactly. You can't just focus on white, heterosexual, middle-class women and claim to represent all women.
And then there's this whole question of whether there even is a shared female experience if you accept that gender is socially constructed.
That's a really interesting point. If gender is fluid, if it's shaped by culture and ideology, then what does it even mean to talk about a specifically female way of writing or reading?
Right. It makes the whole thing a lot more complicated, doesn't it? So where does gynocriticism fit into this bigger picture of feminist literary criticism?
It can be hard to draw really clear lines
Mm-hmm.
because feminist thought has evolved so much over time. But there are some common threads that run through most feminist literary criticism. The biggest one is obviously advocating for equality, but also exploring how gender influences writing itself, how women's writing might differ from men's.
Not necessarily better or worse, just different.
Exactly. And another big part is analyzing how male-dominated social structures impact women and their writing.
It's all about understanding how power works, right? How gender impacts who gets to tell their stories and how those stories are told. Now, our source mentions some different approaches within feminism, American, French, British. Let's start with American feminism. What's its main focus when it comes to literature?
A lot of American feminist criticism involves going back and looking at both male and female authors through a feminist lens. So, you might take a canonical male writer, like, say, Hemingway, and analyze his work from a woman's perspective, looking for how it reflects or reinforces patriarchal ideas.
Like uncovering the hidden biases that we might not even notice at first glance.
Exactly. And of course, gynocriticism is part of this tradition. As we talked about, it's very much focused on establishing a literature of their own for women writers, understanding their perspectives, and preserving their work.
It's like recovering those lost voices, giving them the space and recognition they deserve. It almost reminds me of the work that's been done to recover and celebrate literature from other marginalized groups, like people of color or LGBTQ writers.
That's a great connection. It's all about giving voice to those who've been silenced or overlooked.
Okay, so American feminism is often about re-examining existing literature through a feminist lens. What about French feminism? What's their angle?
French feminism tends to be very focused on language itself, the idea that language is a phallocentric realm.
Like a system of meaning that's inherently biased toward male perspectives?
Right. They look at how language shapes women's roles and experiences, how it can limit their expression. Some even draw a connection between feminine writing and the female body.
Whoa, that's interesting. So they're saying there's a link between the suppression of female sexuality and the suppression of female creativity.
That's the argument. However, that particular perspective has received some criticism, with concerns that it might reduce women to their biological functions. Key figures in French feminism, people like Julia Kristeva, Helene Cixous, Lucia Garay.
Names I should definitely familiarize myself with.
They offer some really interesting and often challenging perspectives.
And it's fascinating how something as basic as language can shape these debates in different ways. Our source even points out that just the fact that English has separate words for sex and gender, while French uses the same word, influences how we talk about these things.
That's a really insightful point, because having separate words for sex and gender in English allows for more nuanced discussions about gender as a social construct, separate from biological sex.
While in French, those concepts are more intertwined.
Exactly. And that linguistic difference definitely impacts the kinds of conversations that are happening within feminism in those different contexts.
It's a good reminder that language isn't just a neutral tool. It carries all sorts of cultural and historical baggage.
Absolutely.
Okay, last but not least, what about British feminism? What sets them apart?
British feminists tend to be very focused on the historical and material conditions that shape women's lives and their writing.
So less about language, more about the actual social and economic realities.
Right. They analyze literature within its historical context, looking at how patriarchal ideologies are embedded in texts and how those texts reflect the power dynamics of the time.
And they're often critical of American feminism for being too focused on these broad generalizations about gender.
Some British feminists argue that the focus on a universal female experience can blind us to the very real differences among women based on class, race, and culture.
That's fair. It's like we were saying earlier, you can't just assume all women have the same experiences.
Right. And British feminism often has a strong emphasis on political action and social change.
Like, it's not just about analyzing literature, it's about using that analysis to fight for a better world.
Exactly. People like Judith Newton and Deborah Rosenfeld are good examples of British feminist critics.
So we have these three main strands: American, French, British, and of course there are many other perspectives within feminism, but these are some of the big ones. Now, our source really emphasizes the influence of Simone de Beauvoir and Virginia Woolf as foundational figures. Let's talk about de Beauvoir first. What were some of the key ideas from The Second Sex that had such a huge impact?
De Beauvoir's book was revolutionary. She really broke down how women are defined and limited in patriarchal societies. Her main argument was that women are consistently positioned as the other, defined in relation to men, not as fully realized individual.
Like they're not seen as the subject, they're the object.
Exactly, and she connected that to economic and political oppression. She argued that literature often reflects and reinforces these inequalities. The whole idea of women as other became a cornerstone of feminist thought.
Right. It's this idea that women are constantly being defined by someone else, by a male gaze. And then Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, what were some of her key contributions?
Woolf was brilliant. She talked about the material conditions women need to write: financial independence, freedom from interruption. She also challenged these dominant male ego structures that she saw in the literary world.
Like she was saying that women need space, both literally and figuratively, to create.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she argued that women should write as women, without trying to imitate male styles. She was really interested in exploring this idea of a collective female subjectivity.
So both de Beauvoir and Woolf were really laying the groundwork for later feminist thinkers to build on. And our source mentions that after them, this whole idea of phallocentrism became even more central to feminist inquiry.
Phallus.
Yeah, phallocentrism.
Yeah.
It's basically just a fancy word for a male-centered worldview.
Right. It's the idea that our ways of thinking, our language, our institutions, they're all structured around male perspectives and experiences.
And feminist critics started really digging into that, right?
Sure.
Like questioning the so-called universal values that are often presented as neutral, but are actually rooted in male experiences.
Absolutely. Challenging stereotypical masculine virtues, recognizing that both men and women are shaped and constrained by these rigid gender roles.
So it's not just about women being limited, men are trapped in the system too.
Exactly. It's a system that hurts everyone in different ways. And of course, this leads to ongoing debates about just how much gender relations impact, well, pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Who we are, how we see the world, how power operates.
Right. Like, is it just about gender, or are there other factors that are just as important in shaping our identities and our experiences?
Exactly. And different theorists have pointed to different things as being key.
Yeah.
The sexual division of labor, child-rearing practices, the ways gender is represented in art and language.
And then there's the whole psychoanalytic approach, right, which tries to understand how patriarchal power structures actually impact the psychological development of women.
Yes, some feminists drew on Freud's ideas, but they did it in a more nuanced way.
Like, not just saying, oh, Freud was a sexist, but actually using his theories to understand the psychological effects of living in a patriarchal society.
Exactly. People like Juliet Mitchell and Nancy Chodorow, they argued that Freud's work could actually be useful in understanding how gender identity is formed within these power structures. They looked at early childhood experiences, family dynamics, the role of the unconscious.
Pretty deep stuff.
It is.
And then there's this really interesting idea that there might be fundamental psychological differences between men and women, that maybe women have a different kind of self, a more fluid self, because of their early connection to the mother figure.
Yeah, that's a pretty radical idea.
It is. Who are some of the theorists behind that idea?
People like Helene Sixus and Luce Irigaray, they've argued that women might be less defined by this need for separation and individuation that's often associated with masculinity.
Like they're more connected to others, more relational.
Exactly. And that this might even lead to a different kind of language, a women's language that operates outside of those traditional male-dominated modes of expression.
And that brings us to Robin Lakoff's work, right? Her research on things like tag questions and how they might reflect women's subordinate position in society.
Lakoff's work was really important. She was one of the first to systematically analyze how women's language might be shaped by their social position.
And she found some pretty interesting patterns.
She did. But of course, her work has been debated and expanded on by other sociolinguists who've looked at a whole range of language issues, like naming conventions, terms of address, the ways women are interrupted in conversations.
It's crazy how language can reveal so much about power dynamics, even in subtle ways. Our source also mentions this idea of writing itself as a potentially liberating experience for women. Like, it's not just about analyzing literature. It's about the act of writing itself being a form of empowerment.
Oh, absolutely. For women, especially those who've been silenced or marginalized, writing can be incredibly powerful. It's a way to articulate experiences that have been ignored, to reclaim your own narrative.
To create a space where your voice can be heard.
Exactly. And it can be a way to connect with other women, to build a sense of community and shared experience.
It's like you're not just writing for yourself, you're writing for all the women who came before you and all the women who will come after you. And Gayatri Spivak, she brings in this really crucial post-colonial perspective, right? She critiques the tendency to present Western experiences as universal.
Spivak's work is so important. She's basically saying, hey, Western feminism can't just assume it speaks for all women. The experiences of women in post-colonial contexts, women of color, they're often very different.
Right, and we have to be aware of those differences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We can't just universalize the experiences of white Western women.
And that brings us to this really important point that our source makes towards the end, which is about recognizing the differences among women themselves. The fact that there's no such thing as a singular female experience.
That's critical. The experience of being a woman is not monolithic. It's shaped by race, class, culture, sexual orientation, all these intersecting factors.
Right, and if we ignore those differences, we end up perpetuating the marginalization of certain groups of women within feminism itself.
Exactly. Like, for example, Barbara Smith, a Black feminist scholar, she pointed out how early feminist work often ignored the experiences of Black women.
Right, and even something like motherhood, the way that's experienced is going to be very different for a Black woman in a society structured by racism than it is for a white woman.
Exactly. It's all about intersectionality, understanding how different forms of oppression overlap and impact people's lives in complex ways. So, to wrap this all up, What are the key things you hope our listeners take away from this deep dive into gynocriticism and feminist literary criticism?
Whew. Yeah, that's a lot to take in.
It is.
Yeah.
But the main point is that gynocriticism was an important first step in shifting the focus of literary study towards women and their unique experiences.
Yeah.
But it's also important to acknowledge its limitations, especially the potential for essentialism and the fact that those early formulations didn't fully account for the diversity of women's experiences.
Right. So it was a starting point, but it's not the end of the conversation.
Not at all. Feminist literary criticism is a constantly evolving field. There are so many different approaches out there, and it's all about engaging with these complex questions of gender, power, identity, and how those things shape literature and our understanding of the world.
And I think ultimately engaging with these ideas just makes us better readers. It gives us a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of literature.
I completely agree. When we open ourselves up to different perspectives, we see things that we might have missed before, and that enriches our experience as readers.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Given how much feminist thought has evolved since the early days of gynocriticism, how might future literary criticism continue to incorporate these ideas of intersectionality and challenge those existing frameworks of analysis? What new approaches might emerge as we continue to grapple with the complexities of gender and identity in literature?
Ooh, good question. It makes you wonder, right? Like, where do we go from here?
Exactly. It's an exciting time to be thinking about these things. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
I agree.
Okay, until next time.
See you then.